Hello!
Hey, everybody!
Welcome to DnDTime Talks, the show where we discuss all things Dungeons and Dragons. I'm Pete.
I'm Jeremy. I'm blind. I can't see anything right now.
Jeremy has a new lighting array set up, and it has rendered him sightless. But you got to do what you got to do for the good of the stream.
It is
how
how
you
it
doing,
is.
Jeremy?
In the middle of taking a sip of delicious and nutritious Coke Zero, at the time of you asking that question. How about you?
Nutritious Coke Zero. I think its calling
water
card
in this.
is that it offers no nutrition.
I don't know. There's potassium. That's good for you, right?
Oh wow!
There's 90 milligrams of potassium, Pete.
Every single Coke Zero is like a banana unto itself. And I am also doing pretty well. I'm excited for DnDTime Talks, as I always am. And also, I see we got a crew, as always, hanging out in chat.
Hello, chat.
To run down the line, I see my boy Polytrea, I see Bionic Shiba, I see Blood Deuce, Reflected 10-8, V Bunny, who said no hello for me. Well, V Bunny, to you I do say hello. And Sword is I got Sword hanging out. Hello to all. We're ready to talk about some Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, see, Reflecting Tonight saying, making the sweet Coke sponsor bucks. There's nothing sweet here except for the delicious taste of Coke Zero.
Coke Zero.
We are not sponsored, but if
Life,
we were, that'd be sick.
Play.
Guys, I'm practicing my sponsor. If we ever get sponsored, which we're not, if we ever did, I would just shill harder. This is just as think of like a demo reel for the sponsors. I'll see. This is how hard I can chill. It's pretty hard.
My bow tie right now would be black, and the left side would say Coke, and the right side would say Zero.
That would be a pretty good bow tie, actually.
I would actually wear that regardless. Yeah.
For folks asking in chat, just want to real quick about the video settings. Because we are only yet affiliates in the eyes of Twitch, we don't have other settings. So if you want to see better, more settings available all the time, get more people to watch. And if we can average 75 viewers, we can get partner status.
Yeah, that is true.
Always have video settings. So
that would be very nice if we could always have those video settings. But for now, we will make do with our what does it looks like, our 810p. Is what
810 pixels. That's
a very odd number, but we enjoy it nonetheless.
1440, right, by 810. Anyway,
1440 by 810. I know not. I'm a fool. Let's talk about factions, though, because that's what we're talking about today on DnDTime Talks. We're talking about factions, what they are, which you probably already know the answer to, but we always run that down anyway. And then really how to run them into your games, how to make them feel kind of like meaningful, make them feel like they have weight in your game worlds, and make them interesting and fun to interact with.
Well, and actually, it's an interesting thing, right? A lot of people think they know what factions are, but there's actually a little bit more to them than more people think. They aren't just powerful people in your world. They have a goal and they have a purpose.
Absolutely.
And factions are really important because they make the world feel real, right? There are always a lot more factions than even like you as a DM think about when you're playing. And of course,
I was gonna say, in the same regard, I think a lot of people tend to feel like that creating factions is a little bit more necessary than it actually is. Like, there's this idea that you need to like have all of these different factions with like vying for different kind of political goals and that are in contestation with each other. A lot of the times, you're going to build a lot of your factions accidentally.
Yeah, precisely. You'll discover them more than create them. And of course, for seeing all of this in action, our upcoming Waterdeep Dragon Heist adventure, first official real episode, is this Sunday. I'm really excited about that. Factions are going to play a pretty major role. So the great kind of field example of what we're going to be talking about today. So let's start from the top.
Oh, and
Mind if I
briefly,
take it away, Pete?
briefly before you do, and I'll hand it off to you in a second. As always, if you have any questions or comments about factions as we're going through, feel free to say so in the chat. And as a reminder, at the end, we're going to do our Ask Pete and Jeremy segment, which we have now started, which is in our Discord, which you can link below if you have anything specific you'd like to ask us, which we'll go through at the end of the show. So, without further ado, yes, Jeremy, please take it away.
So, a faction is, in essence, it is a group of individuals that share kind of a common trait, ideal, or goal, and they work together, generally speaking, obviously, but they can be discrete. And players tend, that's their viewed as a faction. The key is they have the potential to upset the status quo in the world, right? Whether that's politically, economically, militaristically, that's what really defines a faction. They have the potential to influence how things currently are, whether that be for better, for worse, or just different. And yeah, that's all that they really are. A group of wizards who sit in their tower and they don't care about the outside world aren't actually a faction because they don't want to influence the outside world. You can make, or I guess they are a faction, but they aren't an important one. They aren't ones you can really think about unless the players decide, oh, hey, I want these people to join us, or something like that. Until the players interact with them, they're really not an important faction.
For sure. By kind of its dictionary definition, a faction is, generally speaking, a subset of a larger kind of political group. And that's the word's roots. That's the word's roots, but in the context that we're speaking about it, it doesn't necessarily have to be a political group. It can be any group of people, but the kind of truth remains that as a faction is a subset of something greater, it has to have something that kind of opposes it in order for it to be a faction. If everyone agrees with each other, there are no factions. There has to be some kind of,
there has to be some kind of opposition. And it's everyone.
Yeah, it's just the world would in that case be the singular faction, and that wouldn't be a faction. There has to be opposing factions to some extent in order for any of them to exist.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about factions is whenever players go to whenever Dungeon Master goes to make factions in their world, right, or makes a player or makes a character, they try and make them really diverse, right? Or there's a lot of depth to these characters. That's not necessarily the same with factions. Factions can simply have one unifying goal. The people within the faction might be unique and different and have differing kind of opinions, but all a faction really needs is a single goal to really define what. So other common factions, if they're not going to be political, right? As I said earlier, economic factions like guilds are a great example. All of the 42 guilds in Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And I'm sure there are more guilds than just that, if those are the examples they give. Even just people from like a particular region can be a faction, right? Like, even if they aren't a political force, the farmers on the outskirts of the kingdom, their influence, right? Their control over the food, that gives them the power to influence the status quo. They are a faction. Even though they have no political influence, right? Or I guess they have that kind of economic clout.
Yeah, absolutely. In the same regard, for anyone who's a fan, for example, of Game of Thrones, and I think you'll understand this, regardless, the North is generally speaking a faction. They just describe Northerners as this collective kind of group of people that are all very like-minded, and they have this sort of stubborn pride and this sort of these traits that lend them to be very defensive of their homeland. And even though they are not an official affiliation, their collected will and love of the North kind of makes them a faction and a force in the world.
Precisely, and of course, the most common faction, the adventuring party. Or it can be many adventuring parties, really. Adventuring parties are small groups of people that work toward whatever common goal they put in their minds. Usually that involves making themselves more powerful. And a faction usually has a little bit more of an ideological bent than that, but sometimes that's just it. Like in the case of for example, a crime syndicate. Their only goal is to entrench themselves and become more powerful. there's not like a big ideological bent to that, and they're very much like adventuring parties in that regard, where
yeah, that's a fair comparison.
For the most part, most adventuring parties tend to be on that I just gotta get stronger kind of thing.
Yeah. Another example I see in chat, Sword mentioned the Great Big Cloud being a faction. Yeah. In the land of D&D time, the Great Big Cloud is the definition of a faction, which is a group of people who all share the common interest in worshipping and kind of spreading the word of the Great Big Cloud, the deity. So it is a religious faction, which is another kind of category you can have that we haven't discussed yet. And
oh yeah,
the
to a lesser extent, also example. A racial faction, as
they're generally lizard folk.
Mostly lizard folk.
And that's another example of a thing that can be the faction, like a people, like the elves of a world could be considered a faction because a lot of them have, similar ideals and goals.
Or they just care about other elves.
Yeah, precisely.
So the next kind of question is, well, why are you thinking about factions anyway, right? Why are we using this this terminology of faction instead of thinking like, oh, it's the elves and the blah, 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 right? You just kind of by default think in that kind of way. Like I said earlier, you kind of discover them just by playing them. Unless your game is solely combat or dungeon crawling, and hell, even in dungeon crawling, you can have factions. Weirder. Odds are you're not going to have any other option but to use factions, right? You're going to forget. Like, you can't avoid it. That's just how people naturally think.
When you said that in dungeon crawling you have factions, I just immediately thought, we are the kobolds of the right dungeon path.
Yeah, like, exactly. It's like, we are the trap makers. We go through the dungeons creating traps. And then it's like, oh shit, this is an interesting faction. I actually love that idea now.
And now I'm picturing further on, there's the enemies of the trap makers, the goblins that are, we are the loot placers. We put the coins and the magic items in the dungeons.
Oh, jeez.
The trap makers are always getting in our way.
God damn it. Keeping on topic here. Whenever you're creating a world and you're building a setting and you're running a game, factions are just going to spring up. They're a byproduct of making the world function smoothly and the plot work. What's important to them is you make them feel like there's a significant force in the world and they actually have the power to change the status quo. Which, that can be hard without going overboard, right?
Absolutely. It's very tough. So there's the question then of how do you start doing that? As always, bump my mic. As always, there are a few kind of questions that you can ask yourself when you're generating a faction. And again, a lot of the times you're going to be thinking about these factions because, they just happen to come up naturally through the kind of, the world that you've begun to weave. Where you begin is by asking yourself, I think there's 3 questions that you can really boil it down to, and I would say they are kind of a why, what, and how in this case. And for starters, the why, when you're thinking about your faction, why is this a group? Why does this exist at all? And a lot of the times that can be pretty simple. If the faction that you're talking about is the government of an entire nation, the why is this faction exists because it is what supports all of the people in this land. But if it's a more maybe a specific faction, say a dissenting, perhaps to form an example here, the government of this nation is a monarchy, but you want to develop a faction that is a group of people. You've had this idea for a group of people that exist within this monarchy that are working together because they want to see their nation transform into a republic. Well, then that is the why for this faction. This faction exists because there is a group of people that don't like the status quo of the government and therefore want to change it, which brings us to our second question, if you want to take it away, Jeremy.
Yeah, and another question for why, you don't always have to necessarily come with a distinct, obvious reason. A lot of the times the whys can be mysterious to players. Take a cult, for example. You have cultists that worship, absolutely, I don't know, evil rocks, particularly, or specifically, or they worship Vegapygmies. No one's going to hate that. And, why do they worship the Vegapygmies? It is lost to time. They have just existed for so long that at this point they exist solely to continue their power. to propagate their ability. And like that can be a reason. You don't have to necessarily be able to nail it down to one specific thing. A great example for that in the Forgotten Realms is the Cult of the Dragon, where why is the Cult of the Dragon a thing? And there's not a reason. They just are. They've always existed. Or they've existed for so long that it doesn't matter.
And your players don't need to know this information. A lot of this is
for you to think.
Is for you, and to inform your decision making and to help you as you're making choices for this faction. Because having that baseline, and I love that, Jeremy, the idea that like there's just no reason for it, because that is having no reason for their kind of thing to exist is very well. One, it's culty, but also.
Well,
the individuals in that would really inform a lot of decisions about those people who might be frustrated with that.
Why is there a faction that supports the monarchy? Because the monarchy has always existed. That's the only reason.
Yes.
Right?
That's the only... I think more so than for the monarchy, it's kind of like the question of like, well, it supports the surrounding region, and it serves a function in that regard.
Oh, sure, but so would a republic.
Yeah.
The argument is it exists and it's working. Right? Anyway,
yes.
Moving along. The next question to ask, what does your faction really want? What is their primary goal? Factions may have sub-goals that they achieve, they want to go and do and achieve, but in the end, they should have one characteristic. This is our big thing. Take a monarchy, for example. Their goal is to continue to rule as the monarchs of their kingdom. Whereas our Republicans want to instill, I mean, whatever. The Republic people from this monarchy want to overthrow the king or queen and install a republic. And that's their primary goal, so that the country ends under the rule of a republic. So, their sub-goals might be, all right, assassinate the king. Or it might be build up public dissent against the king and force him to abdicate. Those are two different paths that this faction could take as to achieving their goal, but their goal remains the same, and that is to get rid of the king. Which actually that moves on to how, which is kind of our third question.
That's kind of your big one, and that's by what means is the faction that you've created going to accomplish their goals? So, like Jeremy was just saying, there's a possibility that they're going to do so through assassination. Perhaps they have other kind of non-violent methods by which they want to accomplish their goals. Perhaps they'll spread information among the people and go about kind of creating a revolution in this kingdom. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach that as a GM, and that's just the process of creating story and telling a story, is thinking about these things and why your faction are going to behave in the way that they are, but kind of deciding on that how and how they're going to do it is going to be kind of the crux of how you make your faction kind of manifest in your game world, and how the players kind of see their influence in the world. By them kind of going out and trying to accomplish their goal through this how, the players are going to start to like get a sense of what this faction is.
Yeah, and I love that, right? Because that's really where they're defined, is in the how. Those two different groups, if we want to assassinate the king versus, we want to point out what he doesn't do great, those are very different ideologies there, different means. That really help define good versus evil in a group. I mean, hell, even a cult, right, where their goal is to become more powerful. Well, okay, if that cult is worshiping Selune, right, goddess of the moon and the stars, that's a very different thing. It's culty, still may not be the best, but their means are better. As opposed to, let's summon the demon lord Orcus. Okay, that's a weird means to that end. Probably not going to work out, but I guess that's what I was saying here, right?
Yeah.
It's a little funky.
But if that is what they're doing, then the players will at least kind of see that that's what they're doing and have an opinion on it and understand how this faction is trying to influence the world.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great way to start introducing those factions, right? How do you want to introduce them? You don't want to start out by saying like, hey, I hear those, I don't know, that cult wants to remove the king, that's usually not how this kind of stuff immediately starts.
Not quite, but I don't think that that's necessarily the wrong track.
Yeah, it's a little
I
blunt.
think, yeah, a little straightforward, but I think rumors and kind of hearing speculation and discussion of a faction before you have the opportunity to interact with them via positively, either positively or negatively. I think that's a great way to start introducing a faction as kind of a first, a first jumping off point. And there are a lot of different ways to do this, or really a couple. And we've talked about this in kind of other settings where we're talking about kind of seeding and adventure, and allowing using different signs as harbingers of what's to come. So perhaps your players can hear rumors about the upcoming faction. They get a newspaper from the street corner, or they hear a herald on the street speaking about how recent kind of turmoil in political office, or recent turmoil among guilds, because one guild in particular is making a lot of noise about something, or one kind of subset of whatever the governing body is trying to create a new law that's going to make major changes in the world. Hearing about it kind of indirectly gives it this kind of subtext of, oh, this is what's happening in the background in the world. This is what's going on around you. And then eventually, when the players have to interact with it directly, it gives them a little context and makes it feel like, oh yes, this was always coming. Like this makes sense that this is happening now. It's not just kind of thrust upon us. And well, that's kind of that's the core thing, is you don't want the players to all of a sudden just be like, oh, there's an evil cult. I know we never mentioned this before, but there is one, and
by the way,
they're about to raise a dragon. Yeah.
Oh, and one of the things actually you said right there, I really love, right? One of your examples was they're going to instill this new law that has this interesting effect. And one of the best ways to really make these factions feel like they're important in the world is have them influence other factions.
Yep.
The monarchy institutes a new law which cripples the guild. Right? There's a very interesting thing that has no effect on the player characters at all. But it really gives the monarchy some legitimacy as a power in the eyes of your players, right? They will see that as a serious faction and something that is really, making waves in the world. Those are big changes, right? Even something as simple as like, they read in the paper that there's now a 5 silver tax on every cart leaving the city. And the players are like, that's 5 silver. Like, I'm rolling in gold. And the guilds are up in arms about it, right? And players don't care. But it gives that extra context that can really, make them important.
And once you do this and you've kind of made this statement, you can let that trickle down even further and kind of put it in a situation where it does affect players. Like the players go on a street corner and go to buy some apples, and like the kind of humble farmer vendor is charging you like 3 gold for an apple because the prices are so high, and they're like barely managing to make ends meet. So even though they still can pay the 3 gold because they're adventure, it does draw their attention to the matter, and now you have this kind of farmer NPC that you can use to kind of voice these dissenting opinions and introduce the ideas of these conflicts to.
What I love about that, right, is like the players are getting mad at the farmer, and it's like, I can't do anything about it. It's because of all the new tax, right? And then the player's like, oh, I care now, right? It's like that thing I heard about earlier, Eureka! I know.
And every player loves that when they have the opportunity to make those kind of connections and to like see the threads in your world align. It feels really satisfying to do.
Absolutely, and it gives that illusion of realism, right? Because it makes sense. And that's such a tiny little thing, right? That you just kind of pulled out as an example. And hell, maybe you said, oh yeah, you read the broadsheet in your tavern in the morning, and you read about the taxes, and you go outside, and as you're walking to the docks in town, you see a stand on the side of the road. There's stands all over the place, but you see it has some really fresh-looking, crisp apples. And it's something the player's like, okay, why are you mentioning this? But one of the players is going to say, I want an apple. Because it's just like, that's how player characters like, oh, I could go for a crisp apple,
I would.
Yeah, right? Exactly. Pete would do it. I think there's a player in every group that would do that. Especially if you took the effort to describe how awful the gruel at the tavern they ate was, right? You put this directly in front of them solely for this purpose of being like, yep, here's this thing that doesn't matter to you, now it matters to you. And it's, a little ham-fisted, but it feels real, and the players are going to really like
it. Yeah, absolutely. So
really,
that's kind of, yeah, I don't know, I agree. It's good. I also very much like apples. So that's kind of like one general way that you can start to move a faction in. But another kind of take on it is you can instead give them an exemplar of that faction, which is to say, an individual who's a member of the faction who represents that faction's ideals and kind of is an agent of their goals. And the players can watch this individual and come to learn about the faction through watching one of its agents do whatever it is that they're going to do. And exemplar is a good word for this, even though it's not necessarily. I think people often think paladin when they think exemplar, but really, just in the name, they are, an example of a particular group. So, when you do this, let's say we're talking about this. If we're going to go back to the kind of the taxes, if we're doing this kind of a government employee doing raising taxes, you could have the players be forced to interact with an agent of the monarchy who's moving around collecting these new taxes and is, enforcing them in perhaps unsightly ways, if that is the message that you want to send with the monarchy. Have the player, the NPC that you're using to represent the ideas, be representative of what you want to convey about this faction. Have them be the thing that the faction is.
Yeah, and I one of the things I really like about that, right, is, let's say, right, we mentioned a 5 silver tax at the wall, and the player's like, oh, 5 silver, that's nothing. Well, make a big deal of it, right? So they get to the wall, and you describe maybe they're planning on going on a long trip that day, so they left early. And describe how, they take your silver, but then they test the silver for its purity, and they weigh it, and you have to give them a couple different silver pieces, and then, oh, you don't have enough silver on you because they didn't accept your first several silver pieces because they were from a foreign mint. So you have to go back into the city and exchange your gold, right? You can make it an ordeal for the players of, I just want to give this guy my 5 silver and keep going, right?
That's really excellent. The bureaucracy of it, I really like that.
Exactly, right? And that's just a cool way to really hammer it in for the players of, like, all right, this is a tiny thing, but, maybe that's just a different way. Instead of the apples, you have this obnoxious, and realistically, it doesn't matter to your players whether they lose half an hour of in-game time, 5 minutes of description, but they get pissed. They're like, I had to wait 45 minutes for this idiot to take my 5. I tried to just give him gold, and he said he threatened to throw me in prison for bribery. Like, that's great.
And if that's what you want your faction to be, if you want it to be this very kind of nitpicky thing, use a nitpicky character that has an incredible eye for detail and is extremely thorough and rigorous. Have that be the exemplar of the organization that you want to do. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like a perfect one-to-one thing. Perhaps if, maybe the particular moneylender or, agent, tax agent, taxman is a little bit sloppy and slovenly, and he is kind of, berated by his fellow tax agents for being out of line with the policies. But make sure you use the opportunity to, even if you're not necessarily doing that with the specific character, use the opportunity to show. You can, even with a character that is not perfectly in a line, you can show what the perfection, like the perfect ideal of that would still be.
Yeah, and this is all part of making factions more interesting, which we're going to probably talk a bit more in a moment. But first, one of the ways you can make them more interesting is by having sub-factions, right?
Yep.
Having smaller subsets. So faction, by definition, right, is a subset of a big group. In this case, the world. And a faction of the people, a subset of the people living in the world. That's a faction. Well, you can break that even smaller. So let's say he has one faction that is, I don't know, the Church of the Great Big Cloud. And beneath that, there are subset. There's the traditionalists in Yuchakis and those kind of cloud people. And there are the Candy Cloud from the Big Rock Candy Mountains. I'm referring to our Pete and Jeremy's DnDTime show that runs every Friday. These are silly religions in there. If anyone's unfamiliar, check it out. It's really cool. It's a lot of fun, actually. Goofy as hell. But anyway, we have these two factions, right? And they're two different just set of beliefs in this regard. They have the exact same goal, which is bring more people to worship the great big cloud, their god. But because of their slight, ideological difference of which cloud is the great big cloud, they kind of clash. And that's a cool way to use subfaction. Really spice things up. Of course, that's a very, exceptional subfaction. There are some more simple too. Do you think of any good ones off the top of your head, Pete?
Yeah, absolutely. You could perhaps within a merchant's guild, there may be a group of individuals that dislike being in a merchant's guild. Merchant's guilds, by definition, usually have to you kind of have to join a lot of guilds because like workers in real life kind of joining unions, the guilds make sure that all of the kind of commerce in a given region is kind of goes through them, and everything is done equally so that there aren't any kind of unfair work practices for certain individuals, and that the kind of they negotiate with the local governments in order to make sure like tariffs are correct. There may be a few members of the guild who have joined it by necessity because they have to survive, but that dislike that they're in the guild, and as such kind of dissent and have their own kind of private markets and their own kind of deals that they make amongst that smaller group in order to hopefully make their own businesses thrive more than the other merchants within their particular guild. And that's just like that's one possibility, and it's just the idea of finding where in these factions there might be kind of breakpoints and ideas of contention, and then having a few people in that faction go along with that ideology.
Yeah, and a great example there, right? So you're taking that guild, and what is that guild? Let's say they're weaponsmiths, right? They make weapons. There are swordsmiths, right? They just make swords. And it's a guild full of people who make swords. What separates this subfaction from the rest of them? Well, maybe these are the master swordsmiths, right? And they think the guild doesn't give them, they don't get enough for what they do, being better craftsmen, right? And or maybe maybe they're a big subset, right? And they're the regular
the non-master swordsmiths,
yeah, right. And they think the guild really just gives way too much to the master, and these kind of and that's why magic item prices are so much higher than normal swords. But these are just cool things of contention, because just by defining what these two factions are, just you've decided, all right, they're sword makers, and there's a sub-faction. This is a very obvious example, right? It's master smiths versus regular smiths. People who make more money, people who make less money. Real life, you think about it, and it clicks. Makes sense. And it's built itself. There's a conflict between the smiths. You can get cheaper weapons, maybe on a black market, but still technically through these guild people if you talk to them directly. Or maybe you can get really, really nice weapons at lower than guild prices if you know the right guy. And these are ways that influences the players, right?
Yeah, directly. Also having each other to bounce off of in that case, by having them to be able to like interact and compare and contrast the two of them, both of them end up feeling more realistic. Like, of course there would be discrepancies in skill level and prices. It makes them feel natural and part of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, unlike player characters, I just want to stress this, and NPCs, these are not deep wells that we are dragging from, that are still making very realistic things, very realistic factions and sub-factions in the world. They're one simple thing that's easy to hang on to, that makes sense. The individuals in those sub-factions might be different. Maybe there's a person in the Master Smith sub-faction, right, who does feel sorry for the other Smiths, but cares more about themselves because they want to make more money for their better work, right?
And I think I was gonna say, I think that's how you kind of, as we're getting into our big topic of how to make your factions interesting, that's where you start to make your factions interesting. I think is in showing the the
That's
minutia
definitely
and
the way, yeah.
the much smaller. The much smaller kind of variations and details of a faction, like this individual that you're talking about here, that cares a little bit more about the people with less skill than himself, and wants to see all of the workers treated fairly. That's a really interesting kind of small point within this greater faction of the Merchants Guild.
Yeah, the little cracks in the iron, definition. If you define a faction as one thing, and then you create an individual in that faction that isn't 100%, isn't in 100% with that goal, you create a little crack, and that's something that the players can really engage with a lot more. You're not going to have players engaging so much with the ultra loyalists. No, the king should rule because my family is a noble family and we'll lose all our money. Right? You're not going to convince them to overthrow the king. But maybe the king's steward, right, who's like, yeah, we were a noble family, but we're now forever, we serve as like servants basically. Right? They're not going to be as happy. Right? That's a crack you might have where they see the faults in the king.
Yeah,
I mean, with
it's
the
great
guilds,
to like
yeah.
it's great to like show the scope of what a given faction can contain, because in the nobility there are, like you said, the stewards that might not care as much. There are the nobility themselves who are attempting to remain in power. There can be kind of members of the nobility, the servants, the people that work there, and who are um, in essence live very kind of nice lives, observing these people and working for and serving these individuals. They are part of this faction, but they are so very different than the people that kind of are
They're a
on top of it.
sub-faction, right?
Yep.
They are that by economic status sub-faction of the nobility.
Yeah, absolutely. And showing the scope, showing the breadth of all of the different people that a given group can have in it. Like you can have characters like even in your merchants guild, you have like the idea of master smiths, and these lesser smiths show other individuals that are part of this guild. Maybe there's some people that are just kind of thieves, that are stealing from other smiths, providing their work as their own, and claim themselves part of the guild to get the guild benefits. You can show all of these people that are abusing the system, all of these different kind of details that you can start to put into factions to show you know show the scope of the faction, like I was saying before, but also at that point, and what we we're talking about with building factions, it just comes down to starting to tell stories.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things I really like to do, and is when you have a faction, right? Let's really hone in for a second on the servants to the noble, right? They're the servant families; they live pretty damn good lives, but they kind of live in servitude under the noble. And maybe the player characters break into a noble estate, they do some stuff, and they're stealing something, and they meet one of the servants, but they convince that servant what they're doing is for the greater good, and that servant doesn't do anything, lets them leave, right? And they leave, and they're like, all right, cool, we've interacted with this one person. And that's what they think of it as, I've interacted with an individual. However, as a dungeon master, you can say, all right, what kind of faction does that individual represent, part of? And
Yeah, that's
they're
great.
part of the servants. And what happened in there? Okay, the player is convinced that individual to rebel against the oh, wait a minute, we've just made a crack in that servant, subgroup, that servant subfaction of the nobility. And maybe you can take that a next step, right? And the next time, if the players have any means of actually regularly running into this person, or hell, maybe they sneak out and visit them, cloak overhead in the tavern, and ask for their help to help me get my family out of this place. And then the players are like, right, because they don't expect. And then when they get there, it's not just that servant and her family, but it's all of them for that noble house, all of the servant family. And then it's like, oh god, we've just dug ourselves into a revolution, right? And it's that tiny little thing where all that happened was they succeeded on a persuasion check to get the servant woman to not, or servant man or whatever, servant lad to not rat on them. And you can really snowball that and make it into a deeper effect.
And there are countless ways you could there's countless ways you could turn that. You could choose to have that servant, perhaps their kind of desire their change of heart ends up, coming back to bite them, and the fellow members of their own group kind of choose to make an example of this individual who failed. And then later on, you see the servant out on the streets begging, or like in the stockades. And now security at the palace has been tightened, and it is significantly more difficult to get in. It's all up to your imaginations and taking these kind of small moments and just seeing what you can do with them. Because really, it's just, as the GM, it's just up to you to kind of make stories out of these moments.
Yeah, and I think factions are a really good organizational tool to do that. Whenever the players do something, think, how does that affect these factions? And hell, just make a notepad and write out the factions as as they show up in your game, just so you're thinking about them. And you glance at them at the end of each session and say, do any of these, are they affected at all by what's happened this session? And, for 90% of them, no. That might affect these guys. They might care about this. They might care. The merchants might care that the players just robbed that bank. Right? And that's something interesting to think about, and how that can kind of snowball. Another thing I really like with making factions interesting is playing against type. So this is something that is a very interesting aspect. It shows up in a lot of the pre-published modules for 5th edition D&D, including Storm King's Thunder, Tomb of Annihilation, and especially in Waterdeep Dragon Heist. Not going to talk too much about that one, though.
no spoilies.
But what I'm talking about specifically is having a faction which is like, they are evil. They are an evil faction. But you have to work with them for some reason or another. And that's really cool. Where, yes, they're an evil faction. Maybe they're liches, right? Or they're red wizards from the Kingdom of Fae, and they live on the slaved backs of undead, and they're evil. And they're very evil. I'm just going to emphasize evil. But you have a common goal of, in Tomb of Annihilation, stopping the death curse. And that's cool. That's really cool, because now you have the players, they have this huge ideological difference, but the goal is the same. And so maybe the players fight against them, but more realistically, maybe they don't. And that's a really engaging thing to get your players to really fight on and chew on a little bit. It's even better, I think, when you have that good faction, and you got the opposite, right? Let's say those cleric or the paladins of, I don't know, Selune, we'll say. I'm just going to say Selune, sorry, Lance. Paladins of Selune. And they find an enclave of werewolves, right? And what do? They slaughter all the werewolves. They just murder them all, even the younglings. And it's brutal. Right? It's a bunch of level 15 paladins murdering level, challenge rating 2 werewolves. It's just a slaughter. Blood runs in the street. And the players have this awful thing of, oh my god, they're just slaughtering these people. And they weren't doing it wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they were doing some stuff wrong, but that's not the point.
And to discuss the possibility of working with these factions and, say the players are teaming up with these paladins to slaughter the water wolves. The water wolves? Wow.
The water wolves?
The water wolves are a new race that I'm developing for D&D time. So they're working with the paladins to slay all of these werewolves. In the process of working on this, they have a lot of time to, if they're working side by side with individuals from this faction, they have a lot of time to think about this group, to think about their goals, to decide how they feel about them, and maybe they learn things about their own characters through kind of seeing the morality of these larger groups and how they align with them. They're a great tool in that regard, what Jeremy was talking about. Again, like working with an evil group, maybe they if they spend enough time working alongside someone who is objectively evil towards a common goal, they start to see a little bit more of themselves in those people, and to come to like relate a little bit more to these evil groups' goals. Great opportunities for character growth, and just some really cool kind of inter-party interaction there, and like discussion of alignment.
I mean, how good, right, is the guard that executes the bandits who surrender? They surrendered, and yet they get killed on the spot because they were bandits. How good, right, is the paladin who cuts off the hands of the thief so that they cannot thieve again? And these are the kind of questions, right, that makes you think, or that make you think, right, how do we actually feel about this faction? Are they really so black and white? And that's always an interesting thought. And I mean, the military group that, all right, we want to just destroy the undead. That's our only thing. We hate undead. Okay, cool. We're conscripting you to help us fight the undead. Oh, no. I don't want to be conscripted. It's for the greater good. And now there's a great, oh, geez, kind of moment where the players have to think, they're good. They have a good goal. But we're gonna have to murder them, right?
And hopefully your players end up looking at these kind of things, and thinking about how it plays out on a much larger scale, rather than looking at the individuals and the things involved, and making, creating these obstacles, or creating these sort of situations in which they're interacting, even though they're interacting with individuals, they're essentially interacting with an organization, gets your players to start thinking on those larger scales, and to, really start taking in the world.
Yeah, interacting with an exemplar of the organization is effectively interacting with that organization's tenants. So those are a really good way to put players at odds, or surprisingly with different factions.
And as if you really want a faction to kind of come into prominence and to be important in your game, you have a group of people that you want the players to interact with. A great way to do that is just to straight up and down have those people ask the players to do something, and have that task tie into what it is that group wants, which, I mean, naturally it would. Just have an order who slays undead, have the players go and kill a bunch of undead. It tells them exactly what the order wants, and it just shows it off plain and simple. That's like a really straightforward way. If players are not kind of getting any of the hints, and not necessarily like picking up on some of the more subtle clues, and the kind of climate of the game that you're trying to create, which, again, we mentioned at the beginning, this stuff is hard. It's easy to kind of think about, but in practice, to kind of generate all of these small details just on the fly in the game and make players kind of feel the world around them, that's really difficult. It takes years and years and years of DMing, I think, to do perfectly, or you'll never do it perfectly, but if you wanted just to like an easy way to start out, just to have a faction, tell the players what they want to do, and the players will incite their goals from what they've been told to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's the kind of deal where not every faction has to be super extreme. Those undead slaying paladins don't have to go from, oh, kill these zombies. Oh, kill that wraith. Oh, one of the teachers at that school Academy of Magic was a necromancer. Slaughter everyone. It doesn't have to go like that.
One time they casted Chill Touch. They must die. Right?
It doesn't have to be that extreme. You can have a lot of very moderate factions. I'd say most factions are very moderate. But yeah, I think that's really about it there, right? And like I said before, whenever you're creating a new faction in your world, or you're thinking, hey, this could be a faction, just write it down. And then just have a list of factions, and you don't have to write anything else, but just glance at them at the end of every session and say, would any of these factions care about anything the players did? And you can create a whole new exciting twist in the story, just by thinking about
it. Yeah, that's a really smart idea. I mean, good notes is always just a good GM tip on the whole.
This one's just super easy because it's take 30 seconds to look at a list and think a little bit, and you're good.
I don't know. I think that kind of sums up what I wanted to say, at least about factions. Did you have any other kind of final notes, Jeremy?
No, that's about it. I really, really, really like when the players are put in a situation where they can be pitted against or with the kind of, pitted with an evil faction, right? Where both have the same goals. That's, I think, one of the best feelings, because it gives, especially your classic good aligned party, that moral struggle of we're helping bad guys, but we're doing it for a reason. And the fact that they try and validate it is just, I don't know, it's cool. It's engaging in a way that, it's just engaging in a way that a lot of, oh, we're going to help the good guys beat the evil guys isn't. It helps.
I agree, absolutely. As like one last example from DnDTime, I remember the most recent Carnival of Souls event. There was an adventure where the players needed to get across Central City, and while the city was in chaos, the collected people, the Cult of the Green Sun, which is decidedly a faction in DnDTime, and the Morts, like the Cult of the Green Sun, had like set up transportation networks underneath the city so that people could get around safely to their homes. And the Morts were like providing supplies because they are the underworld and they have tons of supplies like hidden, in basements and in speakeasies underground. And that's just like a really kind of fun seeing how these factions interplay with each other in situations when all of them are tested. And
absolutely.
That's just that kind of stuff can just be really cool to see how extreme circumstances and just circumstances in general affect these different groups.
Yep. No, I totally agree.
So that's it. We're done.
That's it. We're done with factions, at least for today. I think we could go we could spend hours talking about just a single faction in extreme detail, but we don't have time for that right now.
Maybe that's more of a DnDTime Worlds thing. Where we just make a faction and really flesh it out, which will be starting up probably next week again, or something else. I don't know. Probably DnDTime Worlds. But before that, Jeremy, it's it's Ask Pete and Jeremy.
Animal fact. Oh wait, shit. wrong segment, guys.
Animal facts.
Animal facts. All right, guys. Our animal fact for today. Did you know that the heart of a shrimp is located in its head? Animal fact.
Is it a real thing?
Fact.
Wait,
I don't know. I just googled animal facts really quick.
Okay, fair enough. So next it's time for Ask.
I wasn't ready for animal fact.
Ask Pete and Jeremy, and we have one question here in Discord from Reflected 10-8. And the question is, what would your OOC medieval style weapon of choice be? Magic/magic items are cheating. What would, if you could pick a weapon to use as a real person? And I have two answers to this. And my first answer is going to be, if it was like, which weapon do I think would give me the best chance in a fight for a medieval style weapon, I would pick a shield.
Really?
I would just block things and then punch people, because that's where I would feel the most confident, I think, in a fight. But if it's just what's my favorite one, I like hammers. I think
hammers I'm a flail man.
Flail's the good pick.
I love flails. Oh yeah, radical.
Shield, although maybe a pike, and just not have to get close to people. That would also
you get wrecked. One dude kind of weasels in on your pike, and you're wrecked, Pete.
Yeah, maybe the shield.
And my flail crushes you.
I'm just thinking shield blocking a flail. That's a tough block.
Yeah. Specifically
flail, I think, is a tough block.
Yeah, it's got the chain. Gotta wrap around all that.
And then another question from Reflected 10-8. What type of lichen would you be? Obviously a were-tiger, because it's the closest to a Rakshasa. Easy pick.
Damn. What would I be? Let's see.
Not a werebear, because it's the closest to an owlbear?
Oh, maybe, actually. I'm just like thinking now of like I'm definitely not aware. I'm like a little bit of a were-rat.
Can I pick one of our
I'm definitely not a werewolf.
If I can pick one of our entothropes, I'd pick the werehopper.
Oh yeah. Oh. Think about those. Of the player's handbook lycanthropes, I think werebear probably is the closest for me. I don't know much about were-ravens because I haven't read anything about them because I was playing in
Were-ravens.
Yeah, they're funky. Anyway, but what was the second one? Oh, right, of our entothropes.
What would you pick, Jeremy? Mine's done. Were-beetle, maybe. There's a lot of those I'd want to be.
I like the beetle.
I do too.
A lot. I don't think it's the best, but it's really cool.
Yeah, I want to make a beetle character very badly.
Big.
just a big flying beetle with dumb tiny little wings. So yeah, that's the answer to those questions. And that's all we got. If you want to ask questions and ask Pete and Jeremy, feel free to post those over the course of the week, and we will get to any more questions next week. That's about it. If we have announcements coming up on Friday, make sure you tune in at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 6 o'clock Pacific Time to Pete and Jeremy's D&D Time, where we will have an adventure, and it will be fun. 3 adventures specifically played with members from our chat and our audience and just our community in general. It's a lot of fun. If you're interested and want to find out more about it, all the information about how to get involved with it and just when it is and stuff is on our website, which is linked below, www.dndtime.stream. And then tune in on Sunday for the first episode of Jeremy Dragon Deep.
It's not the first episode. It's the second episode.
Well, it's episode 1.
It's
the second episode, but it's episode 1.
Yes, on Sunday we're going to have our second episode, first episode of Waterdeep Dragon Heist. I'm really excited about Dragon Heist.
Dungeon Deep Water Heist.
I'm super feeling it. I'm loving the characters the guys put together last week on our episode 0.
I'm a halfling.
Pete's a halfling. Pete gets to play his wholesome, friendly, happy halfling, and I'm sure nothing will go wrong for them the whole time.
I have halfling luck.
But no, I'm just really excited. It's going to be great. Yeah, they're going to kick off the adventure. We're going to see how that goes.
Yep, so it'll be good. So I think that's it. Again, thank you all so much for watching. We appreciate you hanging out. Listen to us talk about factions and just D&D in general. And look forward to seeing you all again soon. I'm Pete.
Oh, actually, I got Jeremy. One last announcement. I'm sorry.
Please.
Item submissions. I know a bunch of you have been looking out for them. They're probably going to, I know I said this week, we're looking more of like next Monday we're going to reopen.
Yeah.
Because we do have some changes to how we want to handle all that. So
still working on a couple details on that.
Yeah, just hold for a minute. But it's gonna be definitely before the end of January. Before the end of January, no doubt, 100%.
This is true.
Okay.
I'm Pete.
I'm Jeremy.
And this is DnDTime Talks.
Talks.
Good night, everybody. Good night. I think we were very out of sync on that one.